Well, thank you very much for that kind invitation, introduction. And I want to thank RIETI for allowing me to share my ideas with this very impressive audience. I have a list of the participants, and I'm quite happy to see representatives of business as well as government, academics, and media. So it's a good platform to share my ideas. Now, I have to apologize that I don't have any real research based on this. No papers are done yet. This is some of my thinking that will go and is going into a book that hopefully will be done sometime. And as a professor understands, starting a book and finishing a book are two very different things. So we don't know when it'll be done, but I'd like to share the ideas and get some feedback from you. So here we go. The title is Unexpected Consequences of GenAI for Globalization. And what I'm going to do is start out arguing that the old globalization is changing, and it's moving more from manufactured goods to services. Now, that's something I've been talking about for a very, very long time. And so I won't spend a great deal of time of this idea that the future of trade is services, which I believe quite firmly. But what I'm going to do is spend most of the time thinking about how GenAI, this new form of AI, affects this idea that the world economy is becoming weightless. It's becoming less things that move, that are heavy, that you can drop on your foot, and more things that are going across wires and fiber. So let's just jump into that. Let me see here. I like to start with this quote: "The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And this is by a famous science fiction writer, Gibbons. And what I mean by this is that if you want to predict what the future will be like in, say, 5, 10, 15 years, you do not have to invent much. You don't have to read science fiction novels. It's already here. Somebody today is already doing it. The question is, which of these avant-garde, edgy things that are doing will become mainstream and which will be dropped? So if you understand the present well and can think about the dynamics which will lead certain practices to spread and others to reduce, you can essentially look at the future by looking at today. And that's pretty much what I want to be doing in that spirit. I want to argue that the things that will dominate international trade in 10 years are already happening. They're just going to happen a lot more. Okay, today we're only going to focus on GenAI. Now, GenAI is a relatively new thing. AI is definitely not a new thing. But the trouble with AI is it means so many different things. Everything from robotic, controlled pickers in Amazon distributions to international translation. It means everything. And I want to focus only on GenAI. And so what I want to do is start with this famous quote by Humpty Dumpty in Alice in Wonderland. And Humpty Dumpty tells Alice, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." So here's what I mean by GenAI. And I understand other people have different definitions, but let's go with this one. GenAI helps humans generate content, find, summarize, and analyze information. That's it. That's what I'm going to look at. Now, what I'm going to do in the next couple slides is make the argument that the nature of globalization already has changed and already shows us the direction it will be going in. But I'm not going to spend too much time on it, just a few slides. The message, the essential facts are that goods trade peaked, services trade didn't. So this is two pairs of charts, and the idea is that goods export ratio fell since 2008, but service export ratio did not fall. So if you look at the left chart, what we have is world goods trade as a percentage of world GDP, all in nominal terms, plotted from 1975 to 2008. And you can see that from in the 70s up to the early 80s, globalization was rising, but not very fast. And then we had this explosive growth in outsourcing and offshoring, which led to a very large increase in the ratio of goods trade to GDP. Much of that was manufacturing, and most of it was manufacturing. But since 2008, that trend has completely turned around. By this measure, it's actually on the way down. There are other measures where it's flat or coming down slowly, but all the measures tell us that what happened in the 90s and early 2000s is no longer happening. Globalization is no longer being driven by goods. If you look at the right chart, we'll see it shows the world's service trade as a share of GDP, and you can see from the scale it's much lower. Most of world trade is trading goods so far. But the trend has not slowed down. You can see a little peak around 2008 global financial crisis, but then it recovered and kept going up, unlike trading goods. So my primary prediction that the future of trade is in services is that left chart, that arrow going up. If for a couple more decades this continues, services will be the most important part of global trade. Moreover, let me go back. If you think about how important services are, this is value, the value of services over the value of GDP. But services are very labor intensive. So in fact, the value added embodied in these exports is much higher per dollar than in manufacturing. So in value added terms, almost half of world value added trade is services trade, not goods trade. And if you think about the number of jobs that are connected to exports, more than half the world's jobs connected to exports are in services, not manufacturing, because services are so much more labor intensive than manufacturing. So what are these services we're talking about? The left chart there shows what the highest level disaggregation of services that's traditional in the data. This data is all on the WTO website now. So traditionally it's divided into three things: transportation, which is self-evident; travel, which is mostly tourism; and then other commercial services, which is the great big yellow part. But I've relabeled it into digitally enabled services because it's really, that's what's happening. This is the stuff that goes over the internet, et cetera. Now, if you want to look at what is in that big chunk, which is yellow on my screen, maybe it's a different color on your screen, but on the right chart blows that up. So that 63% of world trade. And you can see some things that are quite familiar. You'll recognize financial services, 13%, insurance and pensions, 4%, IP charges like Netflix, that's 9%, or royalties. And then there's telecoms, computers, and information, which is the 21%. That's the sort of stuff you have in mind that India is exporting. And then there's a big chunk, other business services, almost 40%. And that's more or less business to business back office services. So it's done in a variety of different ways, and it's a wide range of things, and it's not well measured, but it's essentially what I think will be the most expanding part of trade and services. One way of saying or characterizing the globalization I want to convince you will come is if the old globalization was goods crossing borders and the offshoring was factories crossing borders, this is offices crossing borders, where people will do telework for companies abroad. Okay, so this is on the left chart showing who does it. This is a digitally enabled service exports. The message is that developing world share is low, but growing faster. So if you take a look at the left pie, you can see that developed countries account for about 2/3 of all the exports right now. And you'll see India, you see that's important. China is just as big as India, which is surprising to some people. And then the rest of the world's 26%. But the right chart shows that dominance of the developed countries is changing. So I put the exports of developed countries and emerging countries together at 100 in 2016 to emphasize the trends. Obviously, the blue line in levels is much higher than the orange line. But as you can see, since 2016, the orange line has been growing faster. So two things are interesting here. Part of the future of trade is going to be emerging markets exporting services, mostly to rich countries, will be a very large part of it. And the second thing is this is not new. Started in 2016. It's just getting big enough now so we're starting to notice it. Okay, so that was fun. That was a new globalization. And now I want to move on and say, what will GenAI do about it? So I will argue that GenAI is likely to make foreign and domestic teleworkers better substitutes. GenAI will thus accelerate trade in intermediate services. So before I move on, let me just talk about intermediate services for 1 second. So this is B2B services, not B2B, not B2C. So there are, and the most famous services, the ones we're familiar with, financial services, are very frequently B2C, providing banking services overseas, for example. But that's heavily regulated and very hard to expand. But intermediate services, which is like the back office services, or the kinds of services that Tata Web Service provides to IT companies in California, those are intermediate services, and they're almost entirely unregulated. Apart from a few things about privacy, they're unregulated. We don't have the certification requirements, so it's not broken. And that's what I'm thinking it's going to go, is intermediate services. So here I'm asking, what will GenAI do to intermediate services? What I want to do is first go through a series of anchor insights about what GenAI does and does not do, in part to clarify my own thinking about what's going on, but also I think the debate about what GenAI is moving so fast, and people tell anecdotes of what it is, and then they spin an anecdote into a huge theory. So I want to go through what I think of as the anchor insights, some of which have been backed up by research. Some are just my assertions and impressions. Okay, this one is research-based. GenAI levels up skills. In other words, all workers gain, but the least skilled workers gain the most. But not in all tasks. There are, in fact, some kind of task where GenAI use makes you worse. The third point is that GenAI works differently than many types of productivity-enhancing technology in that it fills in gaps. So, for example, I was having lunch at IMD with some of my colleagues who work in the Competitiveness Center, and this colleague admitted that he was very good at the analysis, but he had trouble writing the code in Excel in order to generate the graphs. Now ChatGPT writes that code for him, and so it's filled in the gap. It's as if it's a form of professional education that fills in the gap and makes weak workers like strong workers who have no gaps. Now here's a very famous study published in Harvard Business Review where BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, took 750 consultants around the world and had them do a dozen or so consulting tasks, typical consulting tasks. Now, some of them who were randomly chosen used AI when they did it. Some did not use AI. And this is ChatGPT they're talking about. It reduced the time, on average, of all the workers by 25%, and it increased the quality of the output by 40% for consulting tasks. So these BCG consultants did the task, then other BCG consultants graded the task, separate people. So what you see with this chart, this is for quality, there was a right shift in terms of quality of use of AI. But the interesting thing is that the least skilled gained the most. So ChatGPT increased skill and quality on average, but gave the biggest boost to the least skilled workers. So over here you can see impact of using ChatGPT on performance of 758 Boston Consulting Group staff. With the bottom half skilled participants, the unaided got a boost of 43%. With ChatGPT, they got a bigger boost. For the top half, they also got a boost in the red compared to the blue when they used AI, but it was a smaller boost, 17% versus 43%. So in some sense, and here's the histogram, it shows a rightward shift of the quality, and it's the least skilled that gained the most. So I've been thinking how to explain that. Why could that be true? And I've come up with this zinger, which I hope you will appreciate. I spent a long time on this. I was awake all night long trying to think of this one. GenAI is trained on the best and given to the rest. Cha-ching. I hope you like that guy. Basically, when machine learning techniques screen through the data and give weight to the better performance. It's not an average training. It gives weight to the better performance. But those skills, which are then trained on the best G7 service workers, can be used almost for free by workers around the world. And that will have implications for global trade in intermediate services. Now, the time saving was like a twist. You shouldn't think about this as sort of everywhere, everything is easier. What this showed was this was a task structure, writing an essay. And what the gray is what the consultants not using AI, this proportion of their time was on brainstorming. That was about 25%. It was faster with ChatGPT. Rough drafting was about 50% for the non-users and only 30%. But the editing and the finalizing was higher for those because you hadn't written the first draft. So it's much more subtle than just everybody's better at everything all the time. Moreover, for some things, this is business problem solving, it made everybody worse on average. And it's not clear exactly why this happened, but I'm guessing that they just relied too much on ChatGPT. It was a very complicated problem that needed some reflection, which wasn't in the data set, so it didn't do well, and they handed in something that they probably could have done better if they'd just given it some more thought. So next insight is, or one insight is, GenAI doesn't automate work, it augments workers. So don't think of GenAI as kind of a rice cooker where you put the water and the salt and the rice in, and tomorrow morning you have rice. This does not work without people, and that has implications for employment. So don't think about GenAI like this, some sort of robot in the computer just throwing out content and documents. Think about it this, there's a person using GenAI who's more productive than they were before, but that person has to be there. Not like robots in factories where the welding robots have completely replaced the humans. That's not this. So GenAI will have economy-wide effects on jobs, employment, and income. I don't think that's very controversial. But I also want to, and just to say, because if you go through on the occupations and you ask which ones are affected by GenAI, most of the estimates come up with 45% of the workforce in G7 countries will be affected by this. So GenAI helps people create content and filter content. So many people have jobs where that makes no effect on them whatsoever. The manufacturing sector, mostly the agricultural sector, manual workers, it has no effect whatsoever. It's the people working in the office buildings around here in Tokyo. They're content generators or content processors, and it will affect them. But it's a lot of people. So service production processes, I want to put out, are very different than industrial processes. And some of my colleagues, I won't name them, I think are thoroughly misthinking what GenAI is doing because they have in mind what GenAI would do if services were like an industrial process. So let me explain that in a couple slides. I'm not a engineer or a business guy much. I teach business people, a lot of fun, but that's not me. But this is my impression of what industrial output looks like. This is a toaster. As you can see, I've used ChatGPT to make all these graphics, by the way. So I have so much fun with this. I'm not sure, see there's a little workers there. I'm not sure why they're so small, but anyways, there they are. So my idea here is these toasters is standardized output. Maybe you have two different models of toasters, but each and every toaster is supposed to be exactly the same to exactly the same quality standards. That leads to optimized, predictable production. And productivity in this setting means you get more of exactly the same toasters with fewer people. Now, if the price of toasters goes down enough, you may sell more toasters, so you may actually need more workers, or you'll need fewer workers. But in any case, the quality of the output doesn't change. That's not at all like services. Services are customized output. Almost every service that's provided is at least somewhat customized. There's a long tail of unfulfilled tasks and messy compromises to meet the deadline. And all of you watching this know what I'm talking about. The report is due. You wish you had more time to check another database. You wish you could have integrated this aspect better. Maybe you wish the formatting was better, but it's due. So you make a cutoff. Is this good enough? I send it off. So productivity might not lead to more tasks, might lead to more tasks being done per unit of output. Or to say it in industrial, instead of making more toasters, it'll make each toaster better. So my argument is that to a first order of approximation, and this is a conjecture obviously, is that the same people will be doing the same things, but at a higher quality with these unfulfilled tasks. And since everybody's doing it, everybody has to do it. So it won't be very disruptive in terms of number of jobs. It won't lead to an explosion of output. It'll just all look better. And if you want an example, think about what corporate reports looked like 15 years ago and what they look like now. There's only one corporate report, annual report per year, but now they're like a piece of art with a beautiful layout and the fonts and there's a theme and they put so much time, whereas before they were more or less like coming from the accounting department. So you got the same thing, but the productivity that we came with our software led to higher quality, not more goods. Okay, so GenAI won't work like industrial automation. It may change quality, not output. Next point, GenAI is not CapEx. It's not a technology you buy. It's a service input like MS Office. And all firms all around the world will use it. So you will be using GenAI to keep up with everybody else. This is not like you buy a new machine to increase the productivity of your factory and it gives you an advantage. This is everybody using Microsoft Office or similar. So all firms will use GenAI to stay competitive, not to gain competitiveness. And this is part of my theme that it's not going to be as disruptive as we think, because basically the table stakes on services will rise and everybody has to meet that. So my conjecture is GenAI's productivity will be absorbed by the long tail of unfulfilled service tasks and messy compromises that characterize so much of service production. Okay, so now let me argue that with an analogy, a couple bold analogies. The question to you is, how much time did you save with these great time-saving innovations? The smartphone. How much time did you save? I remember when I got a smartphone, this is wonderful. I can work through some emails while I'm waiting for the bus. Oh, this is wonderful. I can make an extra call to a line on this part of it. First, for 2 weeks, it saved me time. After that, more calls, more messages, more emails. So nobody went home early because of the smartphone. In fact, we worked more. So the idea that GenAI is increasing productivity, that means people will lose their jobs, is thinking about services as if it was an industrial process. When in fact, what it is possible, like the smartphone, just make us do more work to produce the same output. And the same thing's true with laptops. Are you finishing your day's work in less time because of these great time savers and quality boosters? The answer is no. How many people lost their jobs because of smartphones and laptops? Not so many. It was transformative, but not disruptive. And my guess is that's what GenAI will do. So moving on to international trade, domestic versus foreign teleworkers. So teleworkers in the G7 tend to be more productive, but also a lot more expensive, like 20 times more expensive. I did a study comparing Colombian workers and New York and US workers in teleworkable industries, and we found that on average they were 1,200% more expensive in America. And Colombia is not a poor country. So AI reduces the productivity and quality differences, as we saw. It levels up. And in this case, it will be leveling up the service workers in emerging markets, but not necessarily, at least not right away, the wage differences. So this will boost international work by making offshoring telework more of a good deal. So that's just simple economic calculation. But I've recently done some work with my colleague, Mike Wade, who's a professor at IMD Business School. We haven't published this yet. We're hoping to get it into a journal, and we may find out this week. But I'll tell you about it anyways. The idea is that GenAI makes domestic and foreign online workers more substitutable. So here's the I'm going to go through this a little bit academic so you get it. So the methodology is we've hired 4 sets of online professional workers. They had to have at least university education. 50 Americans using AI, 50 Americans not using AI, 50 South Africans using AI, and 50 South Africans not using AI. And each one did 3 tasks. An administrative work, which was to draft an email to a new client explaining your product in a culturally sensitive way. And you're writing this for your boss to send to the new client. The second was to come up with the creative idea for a 90-second ad that was supposed to be adaptable to different settings. And the last one was to take a table of data of gross sales and explain which products were growing. So they all did all 3. So the quality was assessed on a grading scale, and we had AI do the grading, natural language processing. We checked it by hand, but we let the machine do it. So this is too small to read, but task 1 was writing the email. Task 2 was to develop a creative and culturally adaptive concept for a 60-second ad. And the last one was logical data analysis of growth potential. So they're very different things. Each worker did each 3 of these. Now, I'm going to show you the results in bar charts, so let me explain the bar charts. There's 4 groups, 2 American groups, 2 South African groups. Half of them use AI, half of them don't, 3 tasks. So here, the blue are going to be the Americans, blue and blue. The green are the South Africans, green and green. And here is the results for the email task, the creative task, and the analytic task. So the results, the first, you see the leveling up very clearly. US workers scored better in every task to start with and without AI, but the South Africans went up by more. So this is the gap without AI, this is the gap with AI. Without, with. So the gap is always smaller with AI. So there's a leveling up going on. The second is GenAI usage raised the average score for US and South Africans. The dark color bars were always higher, so it raised everybody's productivity. Lastly, the GenAI equalized upwards in the sense that they gained more. I guess I said that already. So this was leveling up, and you can see since we paid the American workers twice what we paid the South African workers, the next time around you might think about using more South African workers. By the way, IMD has a big offshore shared service center in South Africa, so we do work with them. Okay, so thus GenAI made South African workers better substitutes for US in terms of value. Now the second round experiment is more direct. We took the 600 answers and paid US online professionals to classify them. To answer, was this done by a US worker or was this done by a foreign worker? Without GenAI use, they classified 60% of them correctly. In the 2 GenAI use, it was random. They could not tell the difference between South Africans and Americans. So it directly indicated that GenAI made foreign and South African workers better substitutes. So closer substitutes. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, before I come to more conclusion things, is a type of GenAI. It's large language model related. It's called simultaneous speech translation. So simultaneous is instant speech translation. Everybody watching this has done sequential translation, verbal. It's even available on Skype and places like that. Or you have conversation modes with Google Translate. Everybody's done that. It's a little awkward, but it's pretty good. And of course, everybody, almost in the whole world, has now been using text translation. So text translation is okay, but it doesn't help you talk to people. Sequential translation is good to talk to people, but it's very stilted. This is going to be with earphone. This guy has an earphone, and he's hearing this guy who's speaking in Spanish, but he's a French speaker, so he hears this guy speaking in French in his ear. And he's speaking French, and this guy who's Spanish speaking hears him speaking Spanish in his ear while they're speaking. So it's not instant. You wait. It's like if you've done a conference with simultaneous speech translation, it's not instant, but it's way more natural. You can have a way more natural flow. Now, that's coming very fast. All they need is some more machine translation, some more computing. So it will be around. The beta versions are already available. It'll be around, should be widespread soon. Now, that will really make foreign teleworkers better substitutes for domestic workers. And when they eventually get it done for Japan, for example, it will unleash a huge amount of Japanese talent on the world market for services. And I think that will be a big advantage for Japan because I've been coming to Japan every year since 1987, if you can believe it. And one thing you can notice about Japan is things are done right. There's a very strong, no matter what it is, opening a car door for a taxi or wrapping a package, whatever it is, it's done right. And in some services, it's super important that it's done right. That's why Switzerland, which is one of the most expensive countries in the world, is a major exporter of services. Because frequently it's not the cheap service that wins, it's the one that's highest quality or best. Okay, so I'm trying to put a little optimism in here for this, for all these people worried they're going to compete with emerging market service workers. So what will GenAI, these are my conclusions, and I've got 2 minutes left. GenAI levels up in productivity and quality. GenAI also reduces cultural differences. I didn't talk about that, but that's also been shown to be true. Because GenAI not only can translate languages, it can translate cultural differences. It can, for instance, write an essay for an Indian audience, or an American audience, or a British audience, and it changes it to remove the cultural differences. GenAI-driven simultaneous speech translation reduces language barriers. Therefore, GenAI will make domestic and foreign teleworkers better substitutes and thus turbocharge trade in intermediate services. And what we should expect is a global tidal wave of talent. So for businesses, the pool of talent you can access should expand enormously. And if you're in a world-class service providing industry, this should open up markets. So that's the kind of business implications. So I think I may finish, I have and so and a whole bunch more slides, but Q&A is usually more exciting. So why don't we go to Q&A, and then if we run out of time, I can catch up with some more slides, if that's all right. Okay, thank you.